In this video, I want to discuss a fascinating question. Is Islam an imperial religion? And I want to draw on the work of an extraordinary Islamic philosopher who's sadly no longer with us, Dr. Shabbir Akhtar, who was an academic at Oxford University. And he wrote this marvelous book, Islam as Political Religion, The Future of an Imperial Faith. And it's uncompromising, hard-hitting, full of extraordinary insights into politics, history, Islam, and so on. He's not in any way compromising with modernity or liberalism. So he discusses this question, is Islam an imperial religion? And I want to just quote some paragraphs from chapter 7 of this book, titled appropriately, An Imperial Religion, no question mark there. It's full of fascinating insights, as I say, into Islam. And he compares it with Western colonialization of Muslim lands as well. So he juxtaposes and discusses imperialism and colonialism. They're not the same, and there's some fascinating differences between the two, and how Islam and Christianity and the West and the Muslim world have instantiated their worldviews into the lands they occupied, and they're big differences. So Dr. Shabbir begins this chapter number 7 as follows. Non-Muslim historians marvel at the Islamic chronicle. With no standing army and hardly any institutions, the early Muslims overthrew 2 gargantuan centralized empires. After uniting the newly converted Arabian tribes, the 4 caliphs took the unified program of an empowered faith to the world. But how did an Arabian religion rapidly expand into a universal civilization that became multi-ethnic, intercontinental, and polyracial? Muslims assimilated and Islamized the cultural products and bureaucratic hierarchies of the defeated empires of Byzantium and Persia. Caliphs enthusiastically employed talented Jews and Christians to build a multilingual, multilegal, polyethnic, and religiously plural, but nonetheless Islamic civilization. Muhammad's faith was an imperial monotheism, which built and enriched many cultures, while eliminating only those local customs which were judged theologically erroneous or morally depraved. In this chapter, we trace Muslim colonization of lands. A point of nomenclature: imperialism can mean remote control conquest, while colonialism is direct hegemony. Now, this is a really important distinction that he makes, and it's often overlooked, particularly in the West, when it's assumed that is so-called Islamic imperialism and Western/Christian colonization are just more or less the same. And they're not, they're quite different. What one is, as he puts it, more like remote control conquest, this is the Islamic version, whereas colonization, for example, as we might see in the French occupation of Algeria, where the population, the Muslim population there, was forced to assimilate and into French secular norms, and women were told to not wear hijab, and French was spoken everywhere. So it's very different from the Islamic model, but he'll look into this. We shall ignore, he says, this distinction for now, but we'll bear it in mind in section 5 below. We shall assess the Caliphate, Islam's earliest imperial institution, which survived into the 20th century, extraordinarily. Investigating classical Islamic notions of legitimate power enables us to sketch the relationship between a post-imperial faith in decline and a secularized legal and political modernity. In Muhammad's day, Christian Abyssinia, Ethiopia, was an independent regional power, while the Persian Sassanids competed with the Roman Byzantines on the world stage. It was a bipolar world, divided between the rival duo of Christian Byzantium, successor, of course, to the Roman Imperium, and Zoroastrian Iran, ruled since the 3rd century by the Sassanid dynasty. The capital cities were Constantinople, of course, and Ctesiphon, the latter about to be replaced by Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid dynasty. The Arabian Peninsula was marginal to the high society of the early 7th century. Few of royal blood had ever heard of Mecca or Medina. A Quranic revelation dated to 7 years before the Hijrah predicts and promises a victory for the Christian Byzantines within a decade or so. Now, this is, if you look it up, this is the Quran, Surah number 30, verses 2 to 6, which actually has a prophecy, a prediction of the future, which of course came true. There was a Christian victory, even though at the time of the revelation, when Muhammad, upon whom be peace, received it, it looked like the last possible outcome. But it was a true prophecy. Another confirmation, of course, of the Quran. Back to Shabbir. Islam, too, will enter world politics. 5 years after the Hijrah, once Muslims had been tested in the crucible of persecution and fear, the Quran promises to empower them. Another remarkable prediction, Quran 24:55. The Quran predicts Islam's eventual imperial reach. Now, often here he'll give you the reference to the Quran. I'm not going to read it out. You can look it up yourself. So it predicts Islam's eventual imperial reach in 61:9 and mocks those who rejects Muhammad's mission, 22:15. We read in a famous authentic hadith, "Every prophet was sent to his own people, but I am sent to all mankind." The Quran eulogized Islam as the true, completed, decisive, and eternal religion. So there are many references there, Quran 48:28 and 98:5. Accordingly, Muslims interpreted this finalized universality to be a divine mandate for imperial expansion, Quran 48:28. The theological foundations of Arabo-Islamic imperialism are contained in Islam's self-image as religion perfected. Muhammad sent epistles and emissaries to Roman and Sassanid emperors, inviting them to embrace Islam. A sincere, simple, and dynamic Arab religion with virtually no institutions rapidly defeated the lethargic and bloated bureaucracies of the Roman Byzantines. Muslims annihilated the Sassanids, who had been internally enervated by their convoluted and torpid royal inertia and externally weakened by perpetual skirmishes with their Byzantine rival. Islamic imperialism was a corollary of the appealing view that all of humanity is one family with a common monogenetic origin and a common political future as one community under God and Caliph. Islam's egalitarian spirit was no doubt universally appealing. From his base in Medina, Muhammad had militarily challenged Mecca's pagan oligarchy. The Islamic enterprise spread speedily from its native Arabia to lay claim to an international heritage inside the worldwide web of lands and peoples. The Islamic belt today extends from Morocco and Senegal to China and Indonesia. No world faith has successfully and peacefully assimilated such a vast range of cultures and races and done it so rapidly and largely permanently. Nor was it, unlike the Mongol hegemony, sheer conquest without any moral or an artistic contribution. Islam is a compulsively political and politically successful faith. Now, these words, this is very controversial to say these words in the West. And I wonder if one of the reasons why Shabbir Akhtar's work was not reviewed during his lifetime, as far as I'm aware, not since, is because it's very, very political and doesn't really fit within a Western perspective, of course, although he lived in England most of his life. but is refreshing, even if one doesn't agree with it. Is refreshing in its candor and its confidence, and he doesn't, as I say, attempt to water down the faith or make it comfortable and amenable to Western sensibilities. He's very, very blunt, but very articulate and eloquent in his views. Islam is a compulsively political and politically successful faith. Alarm bells going off there. Indeed, it succeeded too much, too early. Early to bloom, early to wither, is a phrase, is as true of civilizations as of individuals. In the final chapter, we note the tragic consequences of these early successes for modern Muslim minorities worldwide. As Islamic empire receded and fragmented, vulnerable Muslims were left to struggle and survive among hostile non-Muslim nations. The Muslim masses still see Islam as a single fraternity, despite the many nation states created arbitrarily by Western colonialists as they formally withdrew. The pain of any Muslim minority is noted and shared by the universal community of believers, although, for racial reasons, Arab Muslims generally remain indifferent to non-Arab Muslim suffering. Controversial thing to say. I'm not sure if it's true. Anyway, then he goes on, and this is he draws an interesting contrast with Christian Europe and Christendom, the idea of a Christian world in the medieval period in the West. Islam corresponds to both Christendom and Christianity. So Christendom, as I say, is the medieval world for many, many centuries, where the whole civilization was Christian. There was no separation between secular, between church and state. There might have formally have been one, but everyone was Christian, and the law was infused with Christian values. Whereas Christianity, of course, is the religion as such, separate from political considerations. Anyway, Islam corresponds to both Christendom and Christianity. So it's a political and a religious phenomena, a deen, as we say. As empires based on religion dissolved, nation states emerged, first in Europe and then globally as a result of European colonial intervention. The imperial Muslim tradition resembles the medieval Christian West until the time of the Treaty of Westphalia, this is in 1648, which first enforced the maxim, which was given in Latin, Aegius Regio Curius Religio in Latin, which in English means whoever's region, his religion. Whoever's region, his religion. And the Treaty of Westphalia first formulated during the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. These four Latin words created the political map of modern Europe by endorsing the disintegration of Christendom into many individual states under sovereign national rulers, rather than a single dominion of the Catholic Church. So here we're obviously talking about after the Reformation, when Europe not only split into nation states, but Christians on a massive scale killed each other in their millions for several centuries, fighting over doctrine, Catholic and Protestant. It's quite extraordinary. The Peace of Augsburg killed the Imperial Corpus Christianum. A nation of citizens divided into religious groups replaced a religious empire divided into ethnic groups and nations. And then Shabbir asks a series of questions. Is Islam a disguised form of Arab imperialism? Are there different types of colonial and imperial hegemony? Can we compare Arab imperialism with the English, Spanish, Dutch, and French varieties? How does Islamic expansion compare with European imperialism, including Christian imperialism? Is Islam's attempt to establish God's sovereignty worldwide any different from the aggression of European nations in their scramble for Asia and Africa? We seek to answer these questions in this chapter. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of the chapter, you'll be relieved to hear, but I do urge you to read it if this interests you. But I do want to just read much later on in this chapter a section about British and European colonialization of the world, because the contrast with Islamic imperialism, so-called, is very striking. And I thought it would just be helpful to share this with you. These are tasters of Shabbir Akhtar's work. And as I've said before, I'm reading from Islam as Political Religion, The Future of an Imperial Faith, published by Routledge. It's an academic work, but I say it's very, very enjoyable and full of interesting insight. Whether or not you agree with him is another matter. I'm not saying we must agree with an author to appreciate his insights. We can say yes and no at the same time to different points he makes, and why not? He's not claiming infallibility. So I'm going to read from page 172, where he has some rather strong words to say about the English, speaking as an Englishman. So here we go. We English have one advantage over other nations. We are not foreigners, quote unquote. This colonial witticism implies that while no one is a foreigner in their own land, it is remarkable not to be one in other people's lands. This was the signal achievement of British colonialization as it annexed a quarter of the world. It's extraordinary this little country controlled such a vast landmass. The United Kingdom, an island of 1,200 square miles, ruled over 9 million square miles, a fact and feat that delighted the devout Christian imperialist Rudyard Kipling. European colonial rule was regal, clothed in the mystique of arbitrary pride of power. Islamic rule, in principle, was meant to be freed from worldly ambition, to become a robust witness to a style of rule where pride of governance was founded on humility of service. Where we dominate, we bring submission to. As with nature, so with politics. The scientist studies nature as a causal system, but on the way to the laboratory, visits the mosque as a grateful penitent. Believers understand the natural world so that they can thank God and thus rule the world in order to serve the King of Kings, meaning, of course, Allah, God. Political humility excludes various sources of hubris. The ethnic pride in land of national or patristic allegiance, the mundane pride of worldly success, the imperial pride of absolute power undiluted by accountability, and the Semitic pride of exclusive and unconditional covenants. The Ummah Muslima is a multilingual and polyethnic society of peoples based on the revolutionary requirement of freely chosen belief in one God. It is motivated by a political monotheism inspired by a hierarchy based on a quality that cannot be inherited. Piety is never automatically an attribute of status, rank, birth, position, or achievement. Moreover, the arbitrary circumstance of nationality, an accident of birth for the majority of citizens, was replaced in favor of a revolutionary view of human nature as monogenetic, descending from one species. If you read the Quran, it often refers to how we all came from one soul, meaning Adam, the original father of the human race. So the idea we are one species, descended from him, but distinguished by levels of piety. This is what makes people different from each other at a fundamental level, is their different taqwa, their different piety, levels of piety. What peoples and tribes believed was the factor that decided allegiance and conferred imperial citizenship. The new Commonwealth was not multiracial. This was considered a fraud. There is only one race, the human race, biologically rooted in one species. Rather, the Islamic community was multilingual, multi-civilizational, but mono-ideological. The group that coalesced around the Arab apostle, he means Muhammad, was set apart from the rest of humanity by its vision of a noble humanism practiced in the way of God. Arab colonialization of lands was expressly religious movement coming on the heels of the messenger's demise and in professed obedience to the Quran's imperial dictate. Quote, "It is he, God, who sent his messenger with guidance and the religion of truth, so that he may cause it to prevail over all religion, while pagans resent it." This is Quran 61:9. See also Quran 48:28. Many Muslim rulers were just conquerors who lived permanently among the indigenous peoples and brought them within the fold of a collectivist faith. That explains why other nations, especially the Turks and the Iranians, the Pakistanis and the Malays, have each had separate love affairs with Islam and often became its passionate adherents, though, unlike Arabs, never its patrons. Voluntary conversions were commonplace. Ordinary people, unlike their corrupt rulers, generally welcomed their new Muslim masters. The aim of Muslim imperialism was to impose Islamic law. Religious minorities were tolerated, even embraced for Islamic reasons. So this is not for some liberal inclusivity. This is part of the DNA of the faith itself. It accepts the other within the system of Islamic civilization, something that hasn't been characteristic at all of Christian civilization, which persecuted and forced conversions of Jews, non-Christians, the Christians they didn't approve of, like Catholics not approving of Protestants, and Muslims, of course. There was no pluralism or freedom in the Christian world. This systematic conquest of territories and peoples in an attempt to establish God's universal sovereignty differs morally from the aggression of nations whose ambitions were divorced from scruple and benevolence. The Islamic narrative contrasts with the imperialist initiatives of European nations. And this is where it really gets into the topic of Islamic European imperialism in contrast with Islamic different version. Theirs was a calculated attempt to achieve power without any attempt to transform it into a morally acceptable authority. The expansion of the European design worldwide was started and finished at a time when Christianity's restraining moral influence was almost zero. This did not prevent the formal alliance of the Bible with the bullet in the most determined enterprise of unmitigated cruelty and hubris in recorded history. It did prevent the European scramble for Asia and Africa in other lands from achieving the dignity that revealed religion may otherwise have conferred on it. One cannot imagine an enterprise more completely treasonable to the cause of Jesus of Nazareth. Wow, this is powerful words here. We cannot introduce nuance and detail about the varying levels of racism and exploitation among the different imperialisms of European origin. The common factors are few. The resources of countless peoples were systematically plundered and the peoples reduced to poverty and dependence. The colonialists, despite being colonizers rather than remote control imperialists, this is more the Islamic model, had no intention of settling in the lands they acquired. It was particularly the British Empire, I think. Obviously, in France, there was an attempt to settle Algeria. Famously, French people did go to Algeria for some time and lived very nicely there, and then they were forced to retreat ultimately back to mainland France. When they decided to grant independence, as if anyone has the right to grant anyone else what is a human birthright, they returned to their European sites. They created synthetic nation states whose government was placed in the custody of a venal elite sympathetic to Western ideals of capitalist exploitation and secular laxity in morals. As Western colonialists physically receded, they remained committed to their protege states ruled by their agents, who ensured that the citizens remained poor and dependent. Former colonies thus remained appendages of the departing powers. How true this is, without naming names, of a number of countries in the Middle East. The whole process was cynically dubbed independence, in quotations, of course. These crimes and inequities of the recent past sustain inequalities of opportunity in the present. Continuing immigration to the West is, as I know from my own experience, one of the economic consequences of Western imperialism. So he himself and his family were originally immigrants to England, as he himself was at a very early age. British and to a lesser extent French imperialists model themselves on the central city-state, which received wealth siphoned off from the rest of the colonies. It is no coincidence that most British imperialists were trained in the classics and dreamed of the glory and grandeur of Rome and Greece. This is very true. The old boys who were trained in the classics at Eton and Harrow, this is schools in England, and they clearly modeled in many ways the British Empire on the Roman example, the glory of that, the so-called glory of that time. Roman imperialism spawned several imitative Western imperialisms. Arab imperialism, as Islam, was sui generis and generated no imitative imperialism. In other words, it wasn't imitating anyone else. It was one of a kind. Islamic imperialism, as he calls it, was unique in that respect. Nor was it located in Mecca as the mercantile hub of the Islamic Empire, because it moved, the capital moved from place to place over the centuries. Europeans conquered much of the globe. In Islamic lands, they began with commercial expansion and exploitation, followed by armed invasion, occupation, and conquest. They ruled some Islamic territories for centuries and some for a few decades. A few, Turkey, Afghanistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, were never colonized. Europeans have, incidentally, never formally ruled any Islamic country for as long as Muslims ruled parts of Spain. That's interesting, because Muslims ruled in Spain for nearly 800 years in a remarkable civilization which brought extraordinary advances in education and knowledge and science and living together, where Muslims and Christians and Jews lived together, mostly in harmony. And it was a lighthouse in the storm of the darkness that engulfed the rest of Europe for many, many centuries in the so-called Dark Ages of Europe. But it wasn't the Dark Ages in the Iberian Peninsula, in what is now Portugal and Spain. It was extremely advanced. So just read that sentence again. Europeans have, incidentally, never formally ruled any Islamic country for as long as Muslims ruled Spain. So that was an interesting comparison. British colonization or colonialism is a case apart, he says. English chains of class identity, gilded fetters for some, but mainly heavy irons for the workers, were transported worldwide, including white nations. The deleterious effect of British colonialism on white colonies has not been noted. Canadians, to take a prominent example, lack a national identity, he thinks, since they never formally repudiated British colonial influence. Unlike the Americans, they missed out on revolution. Australians remain ambivalent about the Republican ideal. I was actually, I met up with a friend of mine who's Canadian yesterday. I won't mention who he is. He's a Muslim. And I asked him about King Charles of England, his recent visit to Canada, and what was how did the population, the Canadians, receive this amazing, visit from our incredible monarch? And he's very clear that well, it kind of made the news, but when the king wasn't there, no one thinks about the British monarchy at all. No one cares about it. No, it's not part of Canadian identity to be royalist or be a monarchist at all. They really just get on with their lives and they just never think about the monarchy, except when he extremely rare appearance and suddenly he's in the media, of course. So I'm not quite sure that the Canadians have, he says, never formally repudiated British colonial influence. This may be a technical truth, but they seem to be getting on with their lives perfectly well without British colonial influence anymore. Anyway, to conclude, imperialism must always rely on a racial aristocracy. Thus, a poor, uneducated white boy or girl from West Virginia can torture an upper-class Iraqi general. Now, this actually happened, of course, in Iraq, and that we've all seen the horrible images and the way that the people who did this, ultimately, the senior figures who authorized this, were never held to account in a court of law, never faced justice. It is no coincidence that non-white nations had to struggle violently for independence, while some white nations, such as Canada and Australia, were peacefully granted independence. The racist paternalism of British imperialism is also apparent in its unduly draconian laws to keep non-white natives in line. This is very true, I think. There are motives, not grounds, for conceit that those who founded their democracies on bloodshed can teach others the art of government. In 1956, Tunisian Muslims refuted the stock French justification for governing North Africa. The Tunisians asked, "Are the French ready for self-government?" End quote. So I'm not going to read any more. It's full of marvelous chapters, this book, which I do recommend, as I keep saying. Islam as Political Religion, The Future of an Imperial Faith by Dr. Shabbir Akhtar, who sadly died just a couple of years ago at the faculty at the University of Oxford. Quite an extraordinary book. And he's written a number of other books as well, which I often go on about, which I'd also recommend as well. So do let me know your thoughts about Islam as an imperial religion. What do you think about Shabbir's view? Is he right? Has he got it wrong? Let me know what you think. And until next time.